The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window of the modest suburban home, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Emma sat at the breakfast table, pushing her cereal around the bowl with mechanical precision. Her grandmother watched her from across the table, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee. The kitchen was quiet, too quiet. In a house with a 3-year-old, there should be chatter, questions, the endless stream of why that defined the age. But Emma offered nothing. She had offered nothing for 8 months now. Had seen the change happen gradually at first, then all at once. 8 months ago, Emma had been a typical toddler, curious, talkative, full of the kind of innocent observations that made adults smile. She'd arrive at his house every Monday and Wednesday afternoon after, bubbling with stories about her friends, her teachers, what she'd learned in music class. Her stepfather, Richard, would pick her up after his work shifts, and Emma would run to him excitedly, arms outstretched. "Daddy, Daddy. Look what I made," she'd shriek with pure joy. That all changed after the night 8 months ago. Couldn't point to an exact moment when she noticed something was terribly wrong. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden screaming or obvious injury. It was more insidious than that. It started with Emma being clingy and withdrawn during her Wednesday visits. She'd hide behind his leg when the doorbell rang. She flinched when her grandfather, Henry, came home from his afternoon walk. "She's just having a shy phase," daughter Sarah had said dismissively, though worry creased her forehead. But then the nightmare started. Emma would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, thrashing in bed, soaked in sweat. When tried to comfort her, asking what she dreamed about, Emma would just shake her head and bury her face in her grandmother's chest. Then the silence came. Remembered the exact day. It was a Wednesday in February. Emma arrived at the house as usual, but she didn't greet with her typical enthusiastic hug. Instead, she walked past her grandmother like a ghost, her eyes distant and unfocused. She went to the living room corner, sat down on the floor, and stared at nothing for 3 hours. When offered her lunch, Emma ate mechanically, without tasting. When asked a simple question, "Did you have fun at school today?" Emma simply looked away. That's when knew something was catastrophically wrong. She called her daughter immediately. "Sarah, something's happened to Emma. I don't know what, but something is very, very wrong." Sarah had dismissed her concerns at first, attributing it to exhaustion or a minor illness, but persisted, describing the behavioral changes in detail, the nightmares, the emotional withdrawal, the refusal to speak. Sarah reluctantly admitted that Richard had mentioned Emma being difficult lately, but he'd assured her it was just a phase. "Children go through phases," he'd told her. "She's being dramatic for attention." But when sent photos of Emma's drawings, dark, chaotic scribbles in black marker on white paper, completely unlike the colorful pictures she used to create, something shifted in Sarah's voice. Over the following months, documented everything. She noted dates, behaviors, physical observations. She discovered small bruises on Emma's arms, finger-shaped marks that looked like someone had gripped her too tightly. There was a faint handprint on Emma's back that she discovered while helping her into the bathtub. When asked how she got the bruises, Emma would simply shake her head and look away. The few times pressed gently for information, Emma would rock back and forth, tears streaming down her face, but no words would come. The workers noticed too. During afternoon pickup one Thursday, Emma's main teacher, Ms., pulled aside with obvious concern etched on her face. "Mrs., I wanted to speak to you privately about Emma," she said carefully. "She's experienced a significant change in the last few months. She's withdrawn, she doesn't participate in group activities anymore, and she has these episodes where she'll suddenly go very still and unresponsive. We've tried to reach out, but she won't talk to us. When the other children approach her, she becomes anxious. Yesterday, Tommy accidentally bumped into her during playtime, and she had what looked like a panic attack." Felt her heart sink deeper into her chest. This was beyond normal childhood shyness or temporary regression. This was trauma. This was the kind of behavioral profile she'd read about in articles her daughter had started sharing with her, articles about childhood PTSD, about abuse, about the ways children's minds shut down when they experienced overwhelming fear or pain. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening. Was preparing dinner when she noticed Emma had taken off her shirt in the living room. Under the fabric, saw what looked like old bruises in various stages of healing, some yellowing around the edges, others still darkly purple. Her hands trembled as she carefully dressed Emma again, whispering reassurances the little girl couldn't hear because she couldn't speak them back. That night made the most difficult call of her life. She contacted the Child Protective Services hotline and reported her suspicions. She described the physical marks, the behavioral changes, the 8-month silence, the nightmares. The person on the other end of the phone listened with the practiced calm of someone who heard these calls regularly, but there was an undertone of urgency in their questions. "Has there been any possibility of sexual abuse?" the caseworker asked carefully. His breath caught in her throat. She hadn't wanted to consider that possibility, but the fear had been there in the back of her mind all along. I don't know," she whispered. "We'll need to conduct an evaluation," the caseworker said. "We'll likely need to remove the child from the home temporarily while we investigate." When the social workers arrived at the house the following afternoon, Emma didn't react. She sat in the living room, holding her stuffed rabbit, while 3 adults asked her gentle questions she wouldn't answer. Her mother stood in the kitchen, her face a mask of denial and anger, and underneath it all, a desperate hope that this was all some kind of misunderstanding. Richard arrived home during the interview and immediately became defensive, his voice rising as he everything, claiming Emma had always been clumsy, always falling, always exaggerating. But the physical examination told a different story. The doctors found evidence consistent with abuse, old injuries, bruises in patterns that didn't match accident explanations, behavioral indicators of significant trauma. Emma was placed in temporary custody while the investigation proceeded. Now, 3 weeks later, Emma sat at the breakfast table pushing cereal around her bowl. The silence was deafening, reached across the table and squeezed her granddaughter's small hand gently. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "Grandma's here, you're safe now." Emma's eyes, still distant and haunted, met hers for just a moment before looking away again, but her tiny hand held on just a little bit. It wasn't healing, it wasn't even hope, but it was a connection, and for now that had to be enough. Detective Sarah sat in her cramped office on the 3rd floor of the police department, the fluorescent lights casting a sickly glow over stacks of case files. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, and most of her colleagues had already gone home to their families, their dinner tables, their normal lives. Sarah remained, as she always did, hunched over the case file marked V. Richard Child Endangerment Investigation. She'd been with the department for 15 years, and in that time she'd worked everything from homicides to white-collar fraud. But nothing, absolutely nothing, cut through her professional armor like child abuse cases. She had a daughter of her own, now 18 and away at college, and she still remembered the terror of those early years, the way her heart would stop every time her daughter left for school, the constant worry about predators lurking in the corners of everyday life. Now, with that maternal fear tempered by years of investigating actual monsters, she found herself unable to compartmentalize her emotions when it came to cases involving children. The file in front of her contained the medical examination results, the photographs of bruises, the behavioral assessments from the child psychologist. But it was the caseworker's notes about the 3-year-old victim that made Sarah's chest tighten. Patient exhibits signs of severe psychological trauma. No verbal communication for 8 months. Nightmares, behavioral regression, apparent dissociation episodes. Consistent with PTSD secondary to traumatic event. 8 months of silence. A child who should be learning her ABCs and asking endless questions about the world, instead trapped in a prison of her own making. A mind that had simply shut down as a survival mechanism. Sarah pulled up the prosecutor's memo on her computer. The case was going to be nearly impossible to prosecute without the victim's testimony. The mother's statements, while supportive of the investigation, wouldn't be enough on their own. The physical evidence suggested abuse, but it didn't definitively point to Richard. A skilled defense attorney would argue that the injuries came from normal childhood accidents, that the behavioral issues stemmed from parental alienation by a vindictive ex-wife, that the child's silence was inconclusive evidence of anything. Sarah had seen guilty men walk free on less reasonable doubt. She leaned back in her chair, running her hands through her hair in frustration. There had to be another way. There had to be something that could unlock this child's voice before her case went to trial. That's when Sarah remembered something she'd read a few months ago, an article about therapy dogs in victim support. She'd glossed over it at the time, thinking it was something for civilians, not law enforcement. But now she pulled up her web browser and started searching. Therapy dogs trauma victims, police dogs victim support, animals helping traumatized children testify. The results were compelling. There were studies from universities showing that the presence of animals could reduce cortisol levels and anxiety in traumatized individuals. There were anecdotal reports of therapy dogs helping children speak about abuse for the first time. There were even a few progressive courtrooms that had implemented dog-friendly witness accommodations. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, diving deeper into the research, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. 2 hours later, she had gathered enough material to make a case. She compiled it into a presentation, pulling relevant research studies and legal precedents, creating a coherent argument for why introducing a therapy dog into Emma's testimony might be legally and ethically defensible. By the time she finished, it was nearly midnight. The next morning, Sarah walked into Prosecutor James' office with her presentation materials. James was Emma's distant cousin, a fact that made the case even more personal for him. His own family had been shattered by Richard's crimes. He looked up from his desk, bleary-eyed from his own late night of case preparation. "James, I have an idea. It's unconventional, but I think it could work," Sarah said, spreading her materials across his desk. James listened carefully, his skepticism evident in his furrowed brow. "A police dog, in the courtroom, during testimony," he repeated slowly. "Sarah, the defense will have a field day with that. They'll argue it's prejudicial, that it's designed to manipulate the jury's emotions." "Yes, they probably will," Sarah acknowledged. "But the research supports it. And more importantly, it might be the only way to get Emma to speak. Without her testimony, we don't have a case. With her testimony, we have a conviction." James leaned back in his chair, considering. Sarah could see the calculations running behind his eyes, legal implications, precedent, the likelihood of an appeal, the certainty of losing without the victim's statement. "What would we need?" he finally asked. "First, we'd need to get the judge's approval. Then we'd need to consult with a child psychologist who specializes in trauma. We need to make sure that the presence of the dog is genuinely helpful and not harmful to Emma. We'd also need to work with a specially trained dog and handler who understand the legal and ethical implications." James nodded slowly. "I'll talk to Judge, but Sarah, this is risky. If it doesn't work, it makes us look desperate. It gives ammunition to the defense." "We are desperate," Sarah said quietly. "We're desperate because a 3-year-old girl has been silenced by trauma, and if we can't find a way to help her speak, her abuser walks free. That's desperate." 3 days later, Sarah found herself sitting across from Dr. James, no relation to the prosecutor, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery. His office was warm and welcoming, with soft colors and comfortable furniture that made Sarah instinctively relax. The doctor had reviewed Emma's file and met with her twice for evaluation. "The science is sound," Doctor explained, his voice measured and professional. "Animals bypass our rational defenses. They speak directly to the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain. For a child who has learned that humans are dangerous, an animal can represent something different, unconditional presence without judgment or threat. The key is that the animal must be exceptionally trained and calm. Any anxiety from the animal would only compound Emma's trauma." "Do you think it could work?" Sarah asked. "I think it's worth trying. The traditional approaches, play therapy, art therapy, talk therapy, haven't broken through her defenses. She's built walls that are extraordinarily effective for a 3-year-old. An animal might be able to bypass those walls in a way that human intervention cannot. But understand, detective, this isn't a magic solution. Emma will still be traumatized, but she might feel safe enough to communicate." Sarah felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Judge Campbell was initially skeptical but ultimately willing to listen. Sarah presented her research, and James presented the legal framework for allowing it. The judge consulted with her own experts, and after 2 weeks of careful consideration, she approved the plan on a trial basis. "But understand," Judge Campbell said, "if this becomes a circus or appears to be unfairly influencing the proceedings, I will stop it immediately. This is about victim protection and justice, not theatrical courtroom drama." Now came the challenging part, finding the right dog and handler. Sarah reached out to the K-9 unit. An officer's name came up repeatedly. Had been with the department for 12 years and had an almost legendary reputation for working with dogs in sensitive situations. He trained 3 therapy dogs and had even consulted with other departments on similar programs. When Sarah first met an Officer Duke at the training facility, she knew immediately that she'd found what she was looking for. Duke was massive, 95 pounds of pure German Shepherd, but when walked him through a room full of handlers, the dog moved with such deliberate gentleness that Sarah found herself relaxing in his presence. Spent 2 hours explaining Duke's training, his temperament, his track record with traumatized individuals. "He's not a trick dog," explained. "He doesn't perform, he just exists, and somehow that's exactly what people who've been hurt need." Sarah watched as worked Duke through various scenarios, loud noises, sudden movements, people in distress. The dog remained centered, responsive, but never reactive. He was, in short, exactly what Emma needed. Over the following month, Sarah and worked together to prepare. They walked Duke through the empty courtroom, letting him become familiar with the space and the acoustics. They prepared legal arguments for the defense that they knew would come. They consulted with Emma's grandmother about whether introducing Duke beforehand might help, and they waited, hoping that when the moment came, Emma would find the courage to speak. The night before the trial, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a 3-year-old girl who deserved justice, who deserved to reclaim her voice. Tomorrow would either be the breakthrough or the beginning of a long, complicated legal battle with uncertain outcomes. Sarah said a silent prayer, something she rarely did, that somehow against all odds it would work. The morning sun rose over the county courthouse like an indifferent witness to the day's proceedings. Inside, the building hummed with the ordinary business of justice, lawyers conferring in hallways, court officers organizing files, judges preparing their dockets. But on the 3rd floor in courtroom B, there was an electricity in the air, a tension that everyone involved in the case could feel thrumming beneath the surface. Emma sat in the back seat of sedan, her small body dwarfed by the car seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit with white-knuckled intensity. Drove carefully, deliberately, her hands steady on the wheel despite the tremor in her voice as she tried to explain what was about to happen. "You're going to talk to some people today, sweetheart. They're nice people. They want to listen to you. You don't have to be scared." Emma didn't respond. She hadn't spoken a word in 8 months and 3 weeks now. Had stopped counting the exact days somewhere around month 5, the mathematics of her granddaughter's silence becoming too painful to track. They arrived at the courthouse at 8:15 a.m. The steps leading up to the entrance seemed impossibly long to, who held Emma's hand firmly but gently, feeling the little girl's resistance with each step. Inside, the corridors were cool and institutional, all marble and echoing footsteps. Could feel Emma's tension multiplying with each floor they climbed, each hallway they navigated. In a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, Prosecutor James sat across from Emma with her court-appointed child advocate, a patient woman named Ms. Richardson, who specialized in working with traumatized children. They were going over the process one final time, though everyone involved understood that no amount of preparation could guarantee Emma would be able to articulate what had happened to her. "Remember, Emma, all you have to do is try," Ms. Richardson said softly. "We're not going to force you to say anything, but if you can, even just a little bit, it would really help everyone understand what happened." Emma stared at her stuffed rabbit's button eyes, offering no indication that she'd heard or understood. Down in the evidence room, Officer was making final preparations with Officer Duke. The dog had been bathed and groomed the night before, his black and tan coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Ran his hands over Duke's body, checking for any sign of distress or tension. The dog remained calm, his breathing steady and measured, his eyes alert but not anxious. "You ready, boy?" whispered, his hand stroking Duke's head in the familiar gesture that had become their ritual before difficult assignments. "Today's going to be important. Today, you're going to help a little girl find her voice." Duke pressed his head against his hand, his eyes closing briefly in what had learned to recognize as the dog's way of confirming his readiness. By 9:30 a.m., the courtroom had been specially prepared according to Judge Campbell's specifications. The gallery, where spectators would normally sit, had been cleared of the public. The judge had issued strict orders that this would be a closed proceeding, accessible only to essential personnel. Sat alone in the first row, her purse clutched in her lap, her rosary beads twisted around her fingers. Behind her sat Officer Sarah, her detective's notebook in hand, her jaw clenched with nervous anticipation. Judge Campbell entered from her chambers at 9:45 a.m., her black robe swishing authoritatively. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that had seen the worst humanity had to offer and maintained her dignity nonetheless. She nodded to the court officer, who immediately moved to collect Emma from the small adjacent room where she'd been waiting. Richard sat at the defense table in an expensive charcoal suit, his appearance meticulously groomed for exactly this moment. His attorney, a silver-haired man named who'd built a lucrative career defending unpopular clients, sat beside him with a leather briefcase full of counterarguments and objections. Richard looked composed, almost serene, a man who'd successfully constructed a wall of plausible deniability around himself. When Emma was led into the courtroom by Ms. Richardson, she looked impossibly small. Her pink dress hung loosely on her tiny frame. Her hair had been carefully braided by that morning, but her eyes were wide and frightened, darting around the room like a trapped animal searching for escape. The court officer guided her to a specially prepared area near the witness stand, not quite the traditional witness box, but elevated enough that the judge and jury could see her. A chair had been placed there, smaller than standard furniture, and beside it was positioned an empty space, the place where Officer Duke would sit. "Emma," Judge Campbell said, her voice deliberately gentle but still carrying the weight of her position, "this is a courtroom. We're here today to try to understand what happened to you. Do you understand?" Emma's eyes didn't meet the judge's. She'd retreated into herself, her small hand gripping the rabbit with desperate intensity. "We have a friend who wants to come be with you while we talk," the judge continued. "His name is Duke, and he's a very special dog. Would that be okay?" There was a moment of silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, Emma's head moved in what might have been a nod. The court officer turned toward the back of the courtroom and gave the signal. The door opened, an officer entered, Officer Duke walking beside him on a special leash. The dog moved with deliberate slowness, his massive frame somehow transformed by his careful gait into something graceful rather than intimidating. The vest identifying him as a support animal hung across his shoulders, official and authoritative. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Richard's face visibly paled as he watched the dog approach. His hands, which had been resting casually on the defense table, suddenly gripped the edge so hard his knuckles turned white. His attorney leaned over to whisper something, but Richard waved him away, his confident facade cracking just slightly. As Officer Duke approached Emma's position, the little girl's entire body went rigid. Every muscle seemed to tense simultaneously, her small frame coiled like a spring. Leaned forward from her seat in the gallery, her heart in her throat, silently praying that this would help rather than traumatize further. Positioned Duke carefully beside Emma's chair. The dog didn't jump or sniff or approach aggressively. He simply sat, his massive frame settling down beside the 3-year-old, his head at approximately her eye level. For a long moment, neither the child nor the dog moved. Then slowly, something shifted in Emma's expression. The rigid tension didn't completely release, but it softened slightly. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened by a fraction of an inch. After a full minute of stillness, her small trembling hand extended toward Officer Duke's head. The moment was so quiet that the only sound was the faint whisper of Emma's breath, and the almost inaudible sigh that Officer Duke made as he felt the child's touch. In that instant, everyone in the courtroom understood that something fundamental had changed. Emma hadn't spoken yet. She still hadn't broken her 8-month silence, but she had made a choice. She had chosen to reach out, to connect, to acknowledge that there might be something in this world worth trusting. Judge Campbell nodded slowly to the prosecutor. It was time to begin. The real work was about to start. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, thick and heavy as a summer thunderstorm. Emma's small hand remained on Officer Duke's head, her fingers trembling slightly against the dog's soft fur. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. But she touched. After 8 months and 3 weeks of complete withdrawal, of refusing to make physical contact with anyone but her grandmother, Emma was touching another living being. Officer held the leash with a barely imperceptible tension, reading Duke's body language with the intimate knowledge that came from years of working together. The dog remained perfectly still, his breathing deep and controlled, his body language communicating absolute safety and unconditional acceptance. This was what had trained him for, not obedience to commands, but the ability to be a stabilizing presence in the midst of chaos and fear. Emma's eyes, which had been darting around the courtroom in panic, began to focus. They settled on Duke's face, on his dark eyes that looked back at her without judgment or expectation. She began to stroke his head with slightly more confidence, her small hand moving in slow, repetitive motions. It was a self-soothing gesture, realized from her seat in the gallery. Emma wasn't just petting the dog, she was petting the dog to calm herself. Prosecutor James sat at his table, notebook open, pen in hand, watching this delicate interaction with the intensity of a jeweler examining a precious stone. He'd prepared his questions meticulously, rehearsed them with the child advocate, consulted with Dr. James about the best approach. But he also understood the paramount importance of timing. Push too hard too soon, and Emma would retreat deeper into her silence. Wait too long, and the moment might pass. He waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Judge Campbell didn't interrupt. The court reporter sat quietly, recording the sound of Emma's breathing, the faint rustling as she continued to pet Duke, the dog's collar making small jingling sounds as he shifted his weight slightly, maintaining his position beside the child. The defense attorney leaned over to whisper something to Richard. Richard shook his head sharply, his jaw clenched. His eyes remained fixed on Emma and the dog, and for just a moment, a flicker of something passed across his face, fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that his carefully constructed narrative was about to come crashing down. Ms. Richardson, the child advocate, sat in a chair positioned where Emma could see her but not feel pressured. She waited as well, her experience telling her that this moment of connection with Duke was perhaps more valuable than any words Emma might speak right now. Sometimes, healing began not with words but with the simple act of allowing another being to be present without threat. His hands had stopped shaking. Instead of her rosary beads, she now gripped the edge of the gallery railing, her knuckles white with tension. Tears streamed silently down her face as she watched her granddaughter engage in what appeared to be the first moment of genuine peace she'd experienced in months. Officer Sarah reached over and squeezed shoulder, understanding without words what this moment meant. After nearly 15 minutes of silence, Emma's mouth opened slightly. A tiny sound emerged, not quite a word but something. A whimper, a breath, a beginning. James leaned forward slightly and spoke in the softest voice possible. "Emma, what do you want to tell us?" Silence, but Emma's hand continued to stroke Duke's head, the motion becoming more deliberate, more purposeful. "Emma, can you tell me your name?" James asked, the question so simple, so foundational that it was impossible to refuse. This wasn't asking her to confront trauma. This was just asking her to confirm her own identity. Emma's lips moved. Nothing came out. She tried again, her throat working as if she were struggling against an invisible barrier. The 8 months of silence had created physical and psychological patterns that her body was fighting to overcome. Officer Duke shifted slightly, pressing his body more firmly against Emma's leg, his weight grounding her, anchoring her to this moment and this place. "It's okay," James said gently. "You can take your time." 2 more minutes passed. Emma's face was flushed with effort. Her hand trembled against Duke's head. She was trying. She was genuinely trying to push through the wall that had imprisoned her voice for so long. Then barely audible a sound. A stutter, a fragment, not quite a word but something attempting to break free. "That's Emma," James said, confirming the partial sound she'd made. "Your name is Emma. That's very good, Emma." Emma's entire body seemed to release tension at having her name confirmed, at having made a sound that was recognized and validated. She took a shuddering breath, her small expanding and contracting. Judge Campbell watched this unfold with a composed expression, but her eyes betrayed her emotion. She'd been on the bench for 23 years and had seen countless witnesses, but she rarely witnessed something as profound as a child reclaiming her voice. "Emma, how old are you?" James asked, continuing with another foundational question. This time the response came slightly faster. Emma whispered, holding up 3 trembling fingers. 3 years old. The simple response that any 3-year-old could give, and yet from Emma it was an entire victory. Was on his feet. "Your Honor, the witness is clearly unable to communicate meaningfully. This entire proceeding is." "Sit down, Mr." Judge Campbell said calmly but with unmistakable authority. "The witness has just demonstrated the ability to communicate. We will proceed, and you will observe respectfully or you will be removed from my courtroom." Sat, his face reddening with frustration at this unexpected turn of events. James continued with careful questions, each one designed to build Emma's confidence and establish the pattern of communication. "What's your favorite color, Emma?" "Pink," came the whispered response, slightly stronger this time. "Do you like dogs, Emma?" Emma looked down at Duke, her hand never stopping its gentle stroking motion. "Yes," she said, so quietly it was barely audible but undeniably a complete word. Pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob of relief and hope. The barrier wasn't completely shattered. Emma still spoke in whispers, still seemed to require the physical connection with Duke to form words. But it was breaking. The 8-month silence was fracturing, and beneath it there was a child ready to tell her story, ready to reclaim her voice, ready to let the world know what had been done to her. James sat back for a moment, letting Emma continue to settle into this new pattern of communication. Officer Duke remained motionless beside her, a 4-legged anchor in a storm, asking for nothing, offering everything. "Emma, I want to ask you about something that happened a while ago, something that scared you. Is it okay if I ask you about that?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her hand stilled on Duke's head, but she didn't withdraw, she didn't retreat. Instead, she took a deep breath, and in a voice still small but growing slightly stronger, she said, "Yes, The courtroom felt the shift. Everyone present understood that they were about to hear testimony that would change everything. That a 3-year-old girl, with her hand on a German shepherd and supported by a room full of adults who believed her, was finally ready to speak the truth. James opened his notebook and began asking the questions that would break open the case wide open. "Tell me what happened, Emma. Tell me about the night you were scared." Emma took another breath. Officer Duke pressed against her side, and slowly, haltingly, but with growing clarity, Emma began to speak. The courtroom had transformed into a sacred space, a place where a child's trauma was about to be given voice and legitimacy. Emma sat with her hand resting on Officer Duke's head, her breathing more steady now, her eyes focused on the prosecutor rather than darting fearfully around the room. Officer maintained his position beside the witness area, his body language communicating that he and Duke were present but not intrusive. Judge Campbell leaned forward slightly, her judicial authority tempered by genuine compassion. Even the court reporter seemed to be holding her breath, her fingers poised above the keyboard, ready to capture every word of this testimony. Prosecutor James began with the most difficult part, establishing the timeline and context. He couldn't rush Emma, but he also needed to build a coherent narrative that a jury would understand. "Emma, I want to ask you about something that happened. Can you remember a night when you felt scared? A night when stepfather was there?" Emma's body went rigid. Her hand gripped Duke's fur more tightly. The dog responded by pressing his body closer to her, his weight providing physical anchoring. For a moment, it seemed like Emma might retreat, might choose the safety of silence over the terror of speaking. But then her lips moved. "Dark," she whispered, "dark night, stepfather. Stepfather got mean." The words came out in fragments, like shards of broken glass that Emma was carefully extracting from her throat. Each word seemed to cost her something: energy, courage, emotional currency she'd been hoarding for survival. "It's okay, Emma," James said, his voice conveying both gentleness and absolute confidence that she could do this. "You're safe here. Tell me what happened when stepfather got mean." Emma's eyes drifted downward, focusing on Duke rather than the prosecutor. This was a technique she developed. She could speak more easily if she wasn't looking directly at the person asking the questions, if she could direct her words toward the dog rather than toward the authority figures who surrounded her. He locked the door," Emma said, her voice still barely above a whisper but growing slightly stronger. I wanted Mommy. I asked for Mommy, but stepfather said I was bad, said I was being bad." His hand flew to her mouth. Tears now streamed down her face unchecked. Officer Sarah's pen flew across her notepad, capturing every word, every detail. "What happened next, Emma?" James asked carefully. "What did stepfather do?" There was a long silence. Emma's small body began to shake. Officer Duke responded by resting his head gently on her lap, providing weight and comfort. It was a trained behavior, practiced and perfected, but it felt like the most natural thing in the world in that moment. He put his hands. Emma's voice cracked completely. She couldn't finish the sentence. Her throat had closed off, her vocal cords rebelling against the words she was trying to force out. Stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, this is inappropriate. The witness is clearly too traumatized to continue. This is." "Sit down, mister," Judge Campbell said with quiet authority. "The witness is communicating her experience in her own way and time. You will remain seated and silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Sat, his face flushed with impotent rage. James waited, giving Emma time to recover, to gather herself. He'd coached her through this moment in his mind 100 times. Push too hard and she'd fragment. Go too slowly and the jury might doubt the authenticity of her account. This was the razor's edge of victim advocacy. After nearly 2 minutes of silence, Emma's body seemed to settle slightly. Officer Duke remained with his head in her lap, and she began stroking him again, the repetitive motion serving as both self-soothing and grounding technique. "He hurt me," Emma said suddenly, the words bursting out like a dam breaking. "He hurt me and it was bad and I couldn't. I couldn't make him stop. I told him to stop, but he didn't stop and I cried and he said I couldn't tell anybody or he would hurt Mommy, and then I couldn't talk anymore because my voice got stuck." The words tumbled out in a flood now, fragmented and desperate and entirely, devastatingly authentic. There was no way a 3-year-old could fabricate this account. The details were too specific, the emotion too raw, the language too developmentally appropriate to be coached or rehearsed. In the gallery, pressed both hands to her face, her entire body shaking with the weight of hearing her beloved granddaughter describe the abuse she'd endured. Officer Sarah's expression was stone-hard, but her hands clenched into fists. She'd heard similar accounts before, but never had the victim been so young, never had the breakthrough been so profound. James's voice became even softer, if that was possible. "Emma, I want to ask you something very important. The person who hurt you, where is he right now? Can you show me?" This was the moment. This was the crucial piece of testimony that would lock down the case, that would move Emma's account from trauma narrative to legal evidence. Emma's small hand released Officer Duke. She turned slightly in her chair, away from the prosecutor, away from the advocate, away from safety. Her eyes scanned the courtroom. They passed over the judge, over the court reporter, over the empty gallery. Then they fixed on the defense table. Emma's arm extended slowly, her tiny finger pointing directly at Richard. She held his gaze, this small child who'd been silenced by fear, now pointing directly at her abuser. "That one," she said, her voice steady for the first time. "Bad man, he's the bad man." Richard's face went completely white. His hands gripped the edge of the defense table so forcefully that his entire body began to shake. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, no sound emerging. For the first time since the proceedings began, his carefully constructed facade, the concerned stepfather falsely accused, the victim of a custody dispute, completely collapsed. Was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor, this is clearly prejudicial. The witness is confused, she's—" "Overruled," Judge Campbell said sharply. "The record will reflect that the witness has identified the defendant. Ms. Richardson, ensure Emma is comfortable. We will proceed." Emma had turned her body to face forward again, her hand resuming its position on Officer Duke's head. The dog pressed against her reassuringly, his presence validating the courage it had taken for her to point at her abuser, to break her silence not just in words but in action. The courtroom energy had fundamentally shifted. Everyone present understood what they'd witnessed, a breakthrough that was both medically and legally significant. The jury, had they been present, would have seen an absolute conviction written across this child's face, heard it in her voice, witnessed it in the undeniable courage it took for her to speak. James continued methodically now, asking questions that would solidify the testimony. What exactly did stepfather do? Where did it happen? How many times? When was the last time? Each question was answered with growing confidence, with Officer Duke providing the continuous anchor that made communication possible. By the time James finished his direct examination, nearly 2 hours had passed. Emma's voice had grown stronger, more confident, though still small and childlike. The complete narrative of abuse had been documented, recorded, etched into the legal record. Then came the moment Judge Campbell had been preparing for. "Mister, do you wish to cross-examine?" Looked utterly lost. How do you cross-examine a 3-year-old victim who just given the most compelling testimony imaginable? Any aggressive questioning would appear as bullying. Any attempt to discredit her would come across as callous. He glanced at Richard, who sat with his head in his hands, the man's shoulders heaving as if he might be sick. "No questions," said quietly, defeat evident in every syllable. Judge Campbell nodded. "The witness is excused." As Ms. Richardson began to guide Emma from the witness stand, the little girl looked back at Officer Duke one final time. The dog had already stood, anticipating the departure. Emma reached out and hugged the dog's neck, a gesture of goodbye and gratitude that transcended words. Everyone in the courtroom bore witness to this moment. The profound connection between a traumatized child and the animal who had given her back her voice. The case, everyone present understood, was effectively over. The courthouse hallway outside Courtroom B erupted into controlled chaos immediately after Emma's testimony concluded. News cameras that had been waiting outside the building suddenly surged toward the entrance, reporters calling out questions that dissolved into a cacophony of competing voices. Officer Sarah moved quickly to shield and Emma from the media onslaught, guiding them toward a private exit that had been prearranged for exactly this scenario. But inside the courtroom, something far more significant was unfolding. Richard sat with his head in his hands, his expensive suit jacket rumpled, his carefully maintained appearance crumbling along with his legal defense. His attorney was frantically flipping through documents, his face a study in barely contained panic. The prosecutor's office had just dropped a bombshell. They were requesting a recess to allow time for plea negotiations. Prosecutor James stood at his table, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a man who just witnessed his strategy vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. He gathered his materials with deliberate slowness, making no attempt to hide his confidence. Judge Campbell, still seated on the bench, called both counsel to approach. She said, her voice carrying a tone that was simultaneously compassionate and utterly final, "I'm granting a 2-hour recess. I suggest you use it wisely, mister. Your client just heard testimony from a 3-year-old victim that was, frankly, the most credible witness account I've encountered in my 23 years on this bench. You might want to advise him accordingly." In the courthouse cafeteria, James sat with a cup of cold coffee, going over his trial strategy with Detective Sarah. "He's going to fold," Sarah said, her confidence absolute. "No jury is going to acquit after what they heard today. Even if they hadn't seen it, the recording is airtight. The jury will watch that testimony and they'll convict within an hour." "Knows it too," James agreed. "The question now is whether he is rational enough to accept reality, or whether his narcissism will drive him to trial anyway." But Richard was, for the first time in his life, confronting a reality he couldn't manipulate or deny his way out of. In the holding cell where he'd been taken during the recess, surrounded by concrete walls and the weight of his own crimes, something inside him fractured completely. Back in the courthouse hallway, a tense negotiation began between the prosecution and defense. Was pale, sweating despite the cool temperature of the building. He presented a series of half-hearted counteroffers: probation, counseling, supervised visitation rights, each one more desperate than the last. James rejected each offer with the calm certainty of a man holding all the cards. "Your client sexually abused a 3-year-old child," James said flatly. "He bruised her, he terrorized her, and he threatened to harm her mother to keep her silent. Do you understand what's about to happen? That little girl just gave testimony that was so credible, so compelling, that any jury in this county would convict him on her words alone. The physical evidence corroborates her account. Her mother corroborates her account. The medical evidence corroborates her account. The only thing that's still missing is the verdict. But that's coming. The question is whether your client wants to spend 25 years in prison or 35 years. His face went through a series of expressions: denial, anger, desperation, and finally resignation. "I need to speak with my client," he said. In the attorney consultation room laid out the reality for Richard with brutal clarity. "The case is over. You've lost. That child to everything, the location, the timeline, the specific acts, your threats to keep her silent. Every single detail matched what her grandmother noticed, what the doctors found, what the evidence shows. You have no defense left. None. The jury will convict you in a heartbeat." Richard sat in stunned silence, his narcissistic shield completely shattered. For the first time since his arrest, He seemed to understand that he wasn't the victim of a conspiracy or a vindictive ex-wife. He was a man who'd committed monstrous crimes against a helpless child, and that child had just against him. "What are my options?" he asked quietly, his voice defeated. "Plead guilty and accept a substantial sentence, or go to trial and face an even longer sentence when you're convicted. Those are your options." By 4:00 p.m., Richard had accepted a plea deal, 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 20 years. He would never have contact with Emma again. He would never have unsupervised contact with any minor for the rest of his life. He would register as a sex offender and would be subject to lifetime monitoring upon his eventual release. As he was led from the courthouse in handcuffs, cameras flashing in his face, Richard's face was a mask of hollow defeat. The man who'd constructed an elaborate facade of respectability and charm had been undone by a 3-year-old girl and a German Shepherd police dog. In the courthouse hallway, Judge Campbell invited the principal parties to her chambers. Sat with Emma, who was now visibly exhausted, the emotional toll of her testimony written across her small face. Officer stood with Officer Duke in the corner, the dog's vest identifying him as a hero of this particular narrative. "I wanted to speak with all of you," Judge Campbell began, her judicial robes draped over a chair, her expression softer now that the formal proceedings had concluded. "What happened in my courtroom today was extraordinary. Ms. She nodded to you showed extraordinary courage in bringing your concerns to the authorities. Detective, you showed innovative thinking in proposing an unconventional solution. Officer, you trained your dog to be a living bridge between trauma and healing. And Emma." The judge paused, looking at the exhausted 3-year-old with eyes that had clearly seen too much suffering to be easily moved, but who was moved now nonetheless. "Emma, you were braver than anyone should have to be. You spoke the truth when it would have been easier to remain silent. That took extraordinary courage." Dr. James, the child psychologist, had been observing from the back of the room. He stepped forward now, his notebook already filled with observations for the case study he would write. "This case will change how we approach traumatized child witnesses," he said. "The data here is remarkable, not just Emma's breakthrough, but how systematically Officer Duke facilitated that breakthrough. This is a paradigm shift." Word of the case spread quickly through legal circles. Within days, law enforcement agencies from across the state were calling the police department, inquiring about Officer Duke's training and the protocols that had been used. Universities began reaching out to Dr. James, wanting to study the case for their psychology and law programs. Legal scholars published articles analyzing the implications of animal-assisted testimony. But more importantly, the conviction sent a message through the community. Predators understood that victim advocacy had evolved, that the justice system was finding new ways to amplify the voices of the most vulnerable. Over the following week, as Emma began therapy sessions with Officer Duke present, her recovery accelerated markedly. The dog became a symbol of safety, of victory over trauma, of the power of finding one's voice. In her office, Detective Sarah received commendations from the district attorney's office, the state police commissioner, and the governor herself. But when she looked at the framed photograph that would arrive a year later, Emma, now 4 years old, standing beside Officer Duke, both looking happy and at peace, she understood that the real victory wasn't the conviction or the commendations. It was a child who could speak again. It was a community that had been moved to action by witnessing the impossible made possible. It was a system that had evolved to better protect its most vulnerable members. The ripples of Emma's testimony would extend far beyond the walls of Courtroom B, creating waves of change that would transform how justice was served to traumatized children across the nation. 3 months after Richard accepted his plea deal and was transported to the state penitentiary, Emma sat in Dr. James' office, which had been specifically redesigned to be welcoming to traumatized children. The walls were painted a soft sage green, and the furniture was low to the ground, making the space feel less institutional and more like a sanctuary. Officer Duke lay on a specially designed mat in the corner, his presence no longer officially mandated by the court, but now requested by Emma herself. Sat in a comfortable chair just outside the main therapy space, close enough to provide reassurance but distant enough to allow the therapeutic process to unfold. "Emma, I want you to tell me about your favorite color today," Doctor said gently. A question so simple and so far removed from trauma that it served as a reset button for the nervous system. "Pink," Emma said without hesitation, her voice clear and confident. "Pink like my dress, and purple. I like purple too now." This represented remarkable progress. 3 months earlier, Emma had been unable to name colors without extreme effort. Now she was not only naming them but volunteering information, initiating conversation, demonstrating cognitive flexibility and emotional confidence. The therapy sessions with Officer Duke present had become the cornerstone of Emma's recovery. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon would bring Duke to Doctor's office. The protocol was simple but profoundly effective. Emma would begin her session in Duke's presence, using the dog's calm energy as a buffer against the anxiety that typically accompanied discussing her trauma. As her nervous system regulated, she would gradually expand into conversation, sometimes about what happened to her, sometimes about completely mundane topics like her favorite foods or the cartoons she enjoyed watching. "Can Duke come to my house?" Emma asked one afternoon, a question that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier when she could barely tolerate being near any living creature except in the safety of the courtroom. "We'll see," Doctor said, making a note in his file. This question represented something crucial. Emma was thinking about connection, about relationships, about the possibility of having the presence of someone or something she trusted in her everyday life. Over the following weeks, the therapeutic team began introducing other animals into Emma's sessions: a gentle rabbit, a calm cat, a fish tank. Each interaction was carefully monitored, but they all revealed the same pattern. Emma was healing. Her nervous system was recalibrating, learning that the world wasn't entirely dangerous, that connection didn't have to end in pain. Notice the changes at home as well. Emma began sleeping through the night without the screams and night terrors that had plagued her for months. She started drawing pictures with multiple colors instead of just black scribbles. She laughed, genuine, unself-conscious laughter, when she played with her toys. She asked questions again, the endless why of a curious child replacing the silence that had been her only voice for so long. "Why is the sky blue?" Emma asked one morning over breakfast. "Because of how light travels through the air," explained, tears of gratitude streaming down her face at this normal, beautiful, ordinary moment of childhood curiosity. But Emma's healing was just one part of a much larger transformation that was unfolding across the country. Detective Sarah had been invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about the therapy dog program. Within 6 months of Emma's testimony, 23 police departments had requested information about implementing similar programs. Within a year, that number had grown to 73. Each implementation required careful training and protocol development. Not every dog could do what Officer Duke did. Not every handler could provide the intuitive understanding that demonstrated. Across the country, police departments partnered with dog trainers, animal behaviorists, and child psychologists to create specialized programs that would allow traumatized children to testify with an animal presence as support. Universities began offering specialized training programs. The University of California's School of Law created a course specifically on animal-assisted victim advocacy, taught by a professor who had attended Emma's trial. The American Psychological Association published guidelines on best practices for animal-assisted therapy with trauma survivors. Law schools across the nation began including case studies of Emma's testimony in their curricula. But beyond the academic and professional developments, something more profound was happening. The cultural conversation about child abuse was changing. Emma's case, which had been widely covered in the media, became a symbol of how the justice system could evolve to better protect its most vulnerable members. Victim advocacy organizations began using Emma's story in their outreach, illustrating the importance of believing children and creating environments where they felt safe enough to speak. 12 months after the trial, Officer Duke was officially recognized as a hero by the Police Officers Association, received multiple commendations. Dr. James published his research findings in peer-reviewed journals, documenting the measurable positive outcomes of animal-assisted testimony for traumatized child witnesses. But perhaps most significantly, legislative changes began to occur. 3 states passed laws specifically allowing therapy animals in courtrooms during child victim testimony. Federal guidelines were developed recommending best practices for victim support animals. Funding was allocated for training programs and research initiatives. Stood in the gallery of another courtroom, watching a different child, a 5-year-old boy named David, testify about abuse with a trained therapy dog beside him. She recognized the setup, recognized the protocol, and felt a profound sense of gratitude that Emma's suffering had not been in vain. Because of what Emma had endured and what she had courageously communicated, this other child had a tool for finding his own voice. That evening, Emma asked if she could volunteer to help with the therapy dog program. At 4 years old, she was too young to formally volunteer, but began bringing her to Officer Duke's training sessions, where Emma would sit with the dog, petting him, speaking to him about her feelings. It was a form of intergenerational healing, a child who'd been victimized now helping to prepare animals to support other victimized children. "Duke helped me," Emma would say simply. "Duke helped me talk again. He can help other kids talk too." In schools across the nation, resource officers began receiving training in trauma-informed practices. Child advocacy centers, which had existed on the margins of the justice system, suddenly found themselves at the center of systemic reform. Mental health professionals who'd previously worked in isolation now collaborated with law enforcement and prosecutors. The entire ecosystem of child protection was being reimagined. In Doctor's office, Emma showed him a drawing she'd created, a picture of herself holding hands with a figure labeled Duke, standing in a courtroom, pointing at a small stick figure labeled Bad Man. It was a representation of her own narrative, her own story, told in the language of childhood art. "That's a powerful drawing, Emma," Doctor said. "What do you want people to know about that story?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness of a small child contemplating something important. "That it's okay to tell the truth," she said finally. "That people will listen, and that you don't have to be scared alone." The words, simple and profound, captured the essence of what Emma's case had accomplished. She had broken her silence. People had listened. And in doing so, she had created a pathway for countless other children to find their voices without being alone in their fear. By the 2nd anniversary of the trial, therapy dog programs had been implemented in courts across 12 states. Training academies were graduating handlers specifically educated in victim support work. Research institutions were funding studies on animal-assisted justice. And Emma, now a healthy, talkative 5-year-old, was being asked to participate in documentaries and educational videos about her experience. But the most important measure of success wasn't the systemic changes or the national attention. It was the simple fact that Emma could laugh, could speak, could trust, could love. It was a little girl who had been silenced by terror, who had been helped to speak by a dog, and who had ultimately helped to transform the entire system designed to protect children like her. The road to healing was long, but Emma was on it. And behind her, following the path she'd illuminated, were thousands of other traumatized children finding their own voices, one therapy dog at a time. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made everything feel fresh and full of possibility. Emma stood in front of the county courthouse, Now 6 years old, her hair pulled back in a neat braid, wearing a lavender dress that she'd picked out herself. Beside her stood Officer Duke, now 9 years old and officially retired from active duty, but making a special appearance for this occasion. The dog's muzzle had begun to gray, his movements slightly more measured than they had been 3 years earlier, but his eyes remained clear and intelligent. Today was the Emma Memorial Therapy Dog Program Recognition Ceremony, an annual event that had begun 2 years after her breakthrough testimony. The courtyard in front of the courthouse had been transformed into a space of celebration, with photographs documenting the program's growth, displays showing the training protocols, and most importantly, therapy dog teams from across the region, handlers and dogs who worked with traumatized child witnesses. Stood beside her granddaughter, her hand resting gently on Emma's shoulder. She'd aged in the past 3 years, but not from weariness. Rather, she seemed to have been transformed by purpose. After Emma's case had concluded, had become an advocate herself, working with child protection organizations, speaking at conferences about recognizing signs of abuse and the importance of believing children. She'd retired from her accounting job to do this work full-time, understanding that her granddaughter's suffering could be transmuted into service. Judge Campbell stood at the podium, her judicial robes exchanged for a professional suit. 3 years ago in my courtroom, something extraordinary happened, she began, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd of law enforcement officers, therapists, judges, prosecutors, and advocates. A 3-year-old girl found her voice with the help of a remarkable dog. Today, we recognize the profound impact that one child's courage and one dog's compassion have had on our entire justice system. The ceremony proceeded with presentations of commendations and recognitions. Officer received a special award for his pioneering work in therapy dog training. Dr. James was recognized for his research that had transformed how psychology was applied to victim advocacy. Detective Sarah, now promoted to captain, received recognition for her innovative thinking that had started the entire movement. But the most powerful moment came when Emma was invited to the podium to say a few words. She climbed the steps carefully, her small frame barely visible behind the podium's microphone, held her breath, wondering if her granddaughter would be overwhelmed by the crowd of several hundred people gathered to witness this moment. But Emma looked out at the sea of faces, judges, lawyers, police officers, therapists, and most importantly, other children who'd benefited from therapy dog programs, and took a deep breath. "My name is Emma," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the courtyard through the sound system. 3 years ago, I couldn't talk. Everybody wanted me to talk, but I was too scared. Then Duke came and he helped me. He sat with me and he didn't make me scared, and that's when I could talk again. She paused, gathering her thoughts with the seriousness of a child speaking something profoundly true. "I want to say thank you to Duke, and I want to say that if you're scared too, it's okay. There are people who will listen. There are people who will believe you. And there are dogs like Duke who will help you be brave." The crowd was silent. Then a single person began to clap Officer, and within seconds the entire gathering erupted in applause. Emma stood at the podium, looking slightly surprised by the response, and then she smiled, a full, uninhibited smile that spoke to the complete journey from trauma to healing. As Emma descended the podium, Officer Duke immediately approached her, and she wrapped her arms around his neck in an embrace of pure affection. It was a moment captured by dozens of photographers, an image that would appear in newspapers and psychology journals, a visual representation of the healing that animals could facilitate. Over the following years, Emma's case continued to generate ripples of change that spread far beyond her initial courtroom testimony. Universities across the country developed specialized programs in animal-assisted justice. The American Bar Association published guidelines on best practices for therapy animals in legal proceedings. Federal funding was allocated to expand training programs and research initiatives. By the time Emma turned 10, Therapy dog programs had been implemented in courtrooms across 42 states. More than 300 dogs had been trained specifically for victim support work. Thousands of traumatized children had with an animal presence providing comfort and grounding. But perhaps the most significant measure of the program's success was the conviction rate. Prosecutors who had therapy dogs available in their courtrooms reported conviction rates that were significantly higher than comparable cases without animal support. Juries responded powerfully to testimony given with animal support, understanding instinctively that a child who could maintain calm and coherence in the presence of a dog was telling the truth. In her high school years, Emma began working with the therapy dog program as a volunteer, helping to train new dogs and handlers. She decided that she wanted to become a child psychologist, inspired by Dr. James' work and her own experience of healing. Her therapists had encouraged this choice, understanding that transmuting her trauma into service was part of her continued recovery and growth. The media attention surrounding Emma's case had been enormous and sustained. Documentaries were made about her story. Psychology textbooks included chapters analyzing her testimony. Law schools taught her case as a landmark moment in victim advocacy. But Emma herself remained grounded, understanding that while her story had been important, there were countless other children whose stories remained untold. In the decade following her breakthrough testimony, Emma became something of an unintentional symbol of resilience and the power of innovation in victim advocacy. She received invitations to speak at conferences, to participate in training programs for therapy dog handlers, to collaborate on research projects. But what she treasured most was the quiet moments, sitting with new dogs being trained, watching them learn to provide comfort to traumatized children, understanding that her own pain had created a pathway for healing for others. Officer Duke lived to be 12 years old, a respectable age for a large dog. When he passed away, Emma was 14. She attended his memorial service with, and hundreds of other people whose lives had been touched by this remarkable dog. Emma delivered a eulogy that spoke to Duke's grace, his compassion, and his extraordinary gift for making traumatized children feel safe. "Duke taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just be present," Emma said, her voice steady despite her tears. "He didn't have to say anything. He didn't have to do anything special. He just had to be there, calm and sure, so that I could find my courage. That's what he did for me, and that's what he did for thousands of other kids. He showed us that we weren't alone." In the years that followed, new therapy dogs joined the program, each one trained in the protocols that had been refined and perfected based on Officer Duke's original work. The program grew and evolved, but its core mission remained unchanged: to provide a bridge for traumatized children between silence and speech, between fear and safety, between victimization and empowerment. By the time Emma graduated from high school, she'd been accepted to study psychology at the University of California with a focus on trauma recovery and animal-assisted therapy. She was writing her college admission essays about her experience, allowing her story to be known more widely, understanding that her vulnerability could serve as inspiration and education for others. In a quiet moment the night before her graduation, Emma sat with her grandmother in the backyard of the house where so much of her healing had taken place, held her granddaughter's hand, marveling at the woman Emma was becoming, confident, articulate, purposeful, healed. "Do you remember," asked gently, "the morning when you couldn't speak at all, when you sat at the breakfast table and pushed your cereal around the bowl?" Emma nodded. She remembered. The trauma of that time would never completely leave her. There were still moments when loud noises triggered anxiety, when certain situations brought back echoes of fear. But she'd learned to metabolize that trauma, to understand it, and most importantly, to use it. "I think," Emma said slowly, "that everything that happened to me was awful, but it led to me finding Duke and finding my voice, and now I get to help other kids find their voices too. That doesn't make what happened okay, but it means something good came from it. Squeezed her granddaughter's hand, understanding that this was the deepest form of healing, not the erasure of trauma, but the transmutation of pain into purpose. Emma's story had become a beacon in the darkness, illuminating the path for countless other traumatized children. That 3-year-old girl who couldn't speak had grown into a young woman who was learning to speak on behalf of all the voiceless victims who came after her. And somewhere, in the hearts of thousands of therapy dog handlers and their canine partners, the spirit of Officer Duke continued on, providing comfort, facilitating healing, and helping children reclaim their voices one testimony at a time. The impact would continue to ripple outward, touching lives that Emma would never directly know, changing systems she might never see, creating a legacy that would outlast her lifetime. All because one small girl had found the courage to point at her abuser and say 2 simple words: "Bad man." In doing so, she had changed everything.